Thanks so much, Carl. It's great to be with you all. Very excited to speak with you directly, but also along with my friend Carolyn Lukensmeyer. I understand that you heard from Dr. Danielle Allen earlier today and highlighted some of the work that we're all doing together as commissioners with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences project, Our Common Purpose. My remarks for the next 25 minutes are going to really focus on some of the things that we've learned here at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine, and specifically our Davenport Institute, on the topic of rebuilding trust in government, specifically how that can be done through better public engagement and better public process. I am going to be pulling 5 slides directly from the training program that Carl just mentioned, Public Engagement, the Vital Leadership Skill. It's a program that we've offered to thousands of local government officials, both here in California and around the country. And the learning that I've done in this work, both in training and consulting, has been that public engagement done right, specifically in policymaking, can in fact rebuild trust in our governing institutions. But what I've also learned is that there really are 2 sides to public engagement. One is the process and technique, and that's certainly an area that we get involved with in our consulting work with municipalities and state governments as well. But there's also a perspective, the perspective on the part of public leaders, whether electeds or administrators, as to whether engaging residents at whatever level, whether it's at the task force level or the broader public level, is in fact a good idea. Because I think where we're at today, in the declining levels of trust that we're seeing across the levels of government, it used to be seen and noted that the declining levels of trust were only seen in our federal institutions, and state and local governments were usually more highly appreciated. But as I'm sure you all know, even those levels of governance are declining in trust. Is that people are increasingly wondering whether public policy is being done to them or with them. And in part, graduate policy programs like ours at Pepperdine are to blame. We are the institutions that are preparing those next generations of public policy experts that go out to the public and help formulate public policy, whether they go into elected office, as many of our alums do, or into the administrative side of policymaking. But again, what I've seen in about a decade of doing this work, both at the state and local level, is that better public engagement, getting a sense and a way of combining or conflating our expertise as policymakers along with the public's expertise, is a way of creating more sustainable policy and also better relationships with the public. I wanted to start with a short story where I first learned about this. It was one of the first public processes that I was ever involved in as a consultant. It was with the city of Salinas, the hometown of one John Steinbeck on the central coast of California. The city back in 2009 was facing a massive budget deficit, in fact, $20 million on a $100 million general fund. And we were brought in by the mayor and city manager to engage residents in a series of budget workshops to help make what were going to be some very difficult decisions, whether it was going to result in service reductions or fee and tax raises. These were going to be very difficult decisions to make. And in the first one of these sessions at a community college cafeteria, we had about 150 local residents show up, and we ran them through a very particular process. It's not worth getting into the methodology, but I'm happy to discuss it later. Suffice it to say, by the end of the evening, the facilitator that we brought in for the process asked the residents for feedback, what they thought it was like to go through this 2.5 or 3 hour process of first learning about the budget and then feeding back. And one woman stood up at the end and said, I really did appreciate, being involved and being asked to participate in this. I learned a lot about the budget that I didn't know, and got to meet some of my neighbors and even people I've never met before, but are fellow residents here in Salinas. But really what I'm hoping is taken away from this is I really don't care what specific decisions are made by the city council. All I care about is those decisions are made in such a way that Salinas is a place that my daughter can come back and live in after she graduates from high school. And I was standing right next to the mayor, a guy by the name of Dennis Donahue, a friend of mine to this point, to this day. And I elbowed him in the gut. I said, Dennis, did you hear that? He goes, yeah, the woman wants a place where her daughter can come back and live and so on and so forth. I said, no, every decision that you make around this budget, while being extremely quantitative and complex, I understand all the moving parts and the tough decisions you're going to have to make. But the way that you're going to communicate those decisions to the public need to be through that lens that this resident of your city just mentioned. That even though you're going to make quantitative decisions, the way your residents are going to hear them is through the lens of place, through the lens of understanding that this person understands her love for the city in ways that will not be addressed in purely quantitative terms. And so if there's any takeaway from the next minutes that we have together, I hope what I'm able to get across is that one way that public leaders can rebuild trust is when they take their technical and technological expertise around policymaking and match it to the non-technical expertise of your residents and the love they have for the place in which they live. So let's pull up the slide deck, if we will, Carl. And I want to take you through, again, these are slides taken directly from the training programs that we do around the state, around the country with state and local government leaders. And I want to start with a quotation from a very important piece in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. This goes back about 5 years, but it's a piece that analyzes a series of policy decisions, both in education policy, youth services, and also social services, where in each instance, arguably policymakers made the right decision. It's the one that you could, in a cost-benefit analysis, say that the legislators and the administrators made the right decision in each of these areas. One instance was in New Jersey, another from Wisconsin, and third was in Rhode Island. But in each of the instances, the policies actually failed. And they failed from what the researchers found was a lack of public engagement in making the decisions. And so I draw out this one quotation here from the piece, which you see. Data-driven practices and programs hold great promise as a means for making progress against seemingly intractable social problems. But ultimately, they will work only when community members are able to engage in them as leaders and partners. As policymakers, elected officials, philanthropists, and nonprofit leaders shift resources to data-driven programs, they must ensure that community engagement becomes a critical element in that shift. Now, again, this is a two-track discussion, and I'm going to engage in the leadership track. The other one about specific techniques and increasingly technologies that can be used to better engage residents, that's a separate discussion. But what I've seen in the work that I get a chance to do in engaging with state and local government leaders is there's also a perspective that's necessary, the want to, if you will, for better public engagement that is necessary before you get to that second level question, which is the how question. We've got to answer the why question first around public engagement before we can get to the how. So if we can bring up the next slide, I want to take you through what I call the 3-minute master's degree. And this is how we move from data to people. Imagine, if you will, that every policy decision you make can be fit within what I call the policy box, and you see the box there. Now, that box is framed on 4 sides, and most of us think about the 3 sides of the box. The first at the top is your policy goal. What is that goal? It could be reducing homelessness, improving educational outcomes, reducing greenhouse gases. But suffice it to say, what that goal is going to be not only your target, but at least one boundary. You see on the right side, money and time. And as you're all familiar with, as policymakers, we do have limited resources, whether it's funding or timeline in which we can better engage our residents. The third side is obviously the regulatory environment. And that regulatory environment can range anywhere from local ordinances to state laws to the Constitution. Now, most of the public policy decisions that we make, and frankly, most of the public policy schools, like mine, focus on preparing people to think about those 3 sides of the box, because your answer should fit somewhere in the middle of those 3 boundaries. But really, the boundary that we don't often think of, that I've seen over the years, is really so determinative as to whether the public will actually trust the decisions that we make, is that bottom side of the box. And if we could pull the next slide. It's history and culture. You know, I found that the most effective public policy makers are good historians. And they know that the policy decision that will work in California is not going to work in Kansas. And the policy decision that's going to work in Kansas is not going to work in New Jersey. And the variable, even with all the other 3 sides of the box being held constant, the variable that makes the greatest difference is whether we understand the public's willingness, through understanding the history and culture, the public's willingness to sustain a policy decision. And the way that our residents understand that we understand the importance of the decisions that we're making is that they want to know that we love the place in which we live as much as they do. Now, I know this sounds pretty squishy. We're talking about love. How can we understand, or how can we know that our public knows that we love a place as much as they do? But I have seen over and over and over again the simple difference between whether a policy succeeds or fails, the simple difference between whether a public trusts their governing institution to make a decision, is grounded simply but profoundly on an awareness as to, do they believe that the policymakers love the place where a decision is being made as much as they do? Now, how that gets communicated is up to you all. But I will say that unless you can communicate policy decisions in such a way that contemplates that this is why this decision works best for us here in Kansas, or this is why this works best here in Oregon or Texas. And obviously, a lot of the work I do is at the municipal level. So understanding why a certain decision works best or aligns with the values of this particular place. Only when we can do that do we give ourselves the best chance of creating trust and sustaining policy decisions. We can pull up the next slide. So this is a concept that I use often in the public engagement training. It pulls in the concept of emotional intelligence. I'm sure many of you as public leaders think about this. This is just one framework of many that can be used to define emotional intelligence. I found this in a piece in the Harvard Business Review, and while the audience that they're focused on are business leaders, I found that this framework adapts very well to public leaders as well, which is why I use it in so much of our training and education programs. And in this, you see these 4 columns. The first 2 are inward looking. The last 2 are outward looking. And what I do in the training of municipal and some state officials is take them through the process of looking in and then looking out. You see that first column with emotional self-awareness. To thine own self be true. And while it sounds trite, understanding our own triggers, understanding what motivates us, but also areas in which will trigger us toward anger or negative responses is so important for public leaders, especially when we have Twitter at the ready and social media at the ready. Where we've seen failures in public leadership is when there has not been an ability to move from emotional self-awareness to that next column of self-management, which obviously understands and considers emotional self-control, adaptability, how we adapt decisions we make to local conditions and changing environments, how we have an achievement orientation, that we're constantly understanding that the decisions we make are focused on making not only change, but positive change in the states in which we live and work, and obviously having a positive outlook throughout it all. I have not seen a time in my 20 years or so of doing this work in which it's been more difficult to be a public leader. And I say that from the local level to the state level and obviously the federal level. Part of this is around the declining levels of trust, but there are other areas that I'm sure you've all discussed relating to technology, the change in access to information, but maintaining a positive outlook is necessary to being an effective public leader. Then we look out, and that 2-minute master's degree, that understanding of the importance of place is where I put squarely in the category of empathy. Putting ourselves in the decisions that we'll make and the impact of those decisions, putting ourselves in the shoes of our citizens, understanding and being able to communicate why you understand that not only why this decision fits in the place in which you're working, but also to understand why it's important that these changes are made. Organizational awareness, understanding what skills and capacities you have internally to deliver on these decisions that you'll make. And then obviously, as you look to that last category or column of relationship management, we're looking at influence, having a coaching and mentoring that's not only internally with your staffs, but it's also very much connected to that positive outlook, thinking as a coach or mentor as you engage your residents in making decisions. Conflict management is at the heart of this, right? Public engagement done well is essentially another way of managing conflict, in my view. Having that teamwork mindset, and then all of these put together resolve in that bottom right-hand quadrant, which is inspirational leadership. And we'll pull up the last slide. Because I believe firmly that public engagement done well, and again, this can be done at the task force level, at the stakeholder level, the more broad public level, equals change management. And I just cannot emphasize enough, and I will acknowledge that some of this might sound squishy, but our public needs to know that we care as much about what makes the community and our states unique as they do. And being able to do that in such a way that is not exclusionary, but at the same time understands that making these decisions for our states in ways that aligns with the history and culture of those states as we go through change is so important to making sustainable policy and political decisions. And so with that, I'll stop my slide and Carl, throw it back to you.